Welcome back, everyone. We will now proceed with session 1 of the workshop. The chairperson for the session is Dr. Christopher Len, who we already met and heard this morning, Senior Research Fellow from the Energy Studies Institute. The speakers are Mr. Karthik Ganesan and Ms. Lydia Powell, and the discussant for the session will be Dr. Liu Yang, Senior Research Fellow at the Energy Studies Institute. And I will now hand the floor to Dr. Christopher Len.
Yes, thank you very much. Each speaker will have 20 minutes, followed by Q&A. And I also want to say that a lot of the issues are recurring themes throughout the entire day. So we can be a bit flexible with regards to time management and with regards to some of the issues that's raised. Yeah, so without taking up more time, Mr. Ganesan, please.
Thank you for that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Karthik. I'm a research fellow at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We're a not-for-profit policy research organization based out of New Delhi. We're 7 years old, as I said, my own area of work is power systems and energy access, and I have predominantly focused on our learnings as part of a book that we came out with, being very shameless in sort of publicizing this year, but it's called Energizing India Toward a Resilient and Equitable Energy System. It came out sometime last year, and it was sort of like an inter-institution exercise involving TERI, CEW and Shell. So it was to jointly sort of look at, 2006 is when India came out with what was the integrated energy policy, and subsequently there hasn't been much discussion on, where exactly do we stand. And we thought that it might be a good time to bring out a publication. So a lot of my talk really just takes off from content that we've delivered based on that in other sessions as well. So without further ado, I think it's again not working. It's working now. Perfect. Yeah, thank you. So we have 7 work areas within CEW itself, and as I said, my own work focuses on energy access in the power sector. We'll sort of try and focus on these two over the course of the presentation. So the topic of the presentation that I've given, as you'll see there, is talks about I think is India's unique energy leap, and incidentally Lydia, who I did speak with, also seems to use the very same phraseology, talking about a leap as opposed to a transition. But it really is because of the situation that India really faces, right? So this is, again, I'm not going to throw a lot of numbers in the course of the presentation, but please bear with me on this particular slide. These are really, the scale of numbers that you're likely to see from India over the course of the next, 25, 30 years in a BAU scenario. Staggering numbers. I think the chair for Dr. Ang in his first presentation said that India is the second largest consumer of coal. Good to bear in mind, we're the second largest by a big margin. India is at about 700 million tons. China is at about 4.2 billion tons. Yeah. So anybody here who does not know the scale of consumption, please be aware that we're nowhere close to matching what China is consuming, and it's many decades away that we'll probably get to 4.2, if at all. In fact, our suggestions are that in a scenario where current policies are in place and that there's acceptance of climate change, India's overall coal consumption may not go beyond 1.6 billion tons even by 2040. So that's because, of course, of the current policies that are in place. Yeah, and I think a lot of the challenges, I think even Dr. Castro in his presentation highlighted, the lack of infrastructure. But we'd like to think that in the last 10 years we've made significant progress in a lot of this. And precisely for a lot of these reasons, I think we will see a transition in India in the way energy is consumed. And as I said, we're seeing 4 transitions that play out in India simultaneously, and that's the beauty of it. It's not like India is going to go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 to phase 4, and this is a vestige of how inequity sort of permeates all aspects of Indian society and the Indian economy. So there's the first transition, which is traditional to modern energy access. Then there's the rural to urban transition, which also is of course happening. And then there's this relative autarky, where everybody was talking about energy independence and how we need to try and source everything from within to sort of be more connected with the global markets. Particularly in the case of natural gas, because India only as recently as 2004 really even started importing natural gas. Until then, India was primarily reliant only on what was produced domestically. And then, between 2004 and 2009, everybody thought we've hit, like a mother load of gas, and then suddenly, all of that started diminishing after 2009 as well. So we will start getting integrated to the global energy system more, despite the fact that we're going to be more renewable energy focused. And the final transition really is growth to sustainable growth. And the reason why all of these will happen simultaneously, just to reiterate the point, is that we've got different sections of society which are faced with different sets of issues. So, even though fossil fuels dominates the energy basket of India, it'll be surprising to many of you that only 70% of India's total primary energy supply comes from fossil fuels. Where's the rest? It's not renewable energy for sure, because you can't have that contributing more than 4 or 5%. It's really biomass, right? Biomass, which is non-fossil, of course, and it's renewable, of course, but in the sense that it's still a traditional source of energy, right? So a lot of the energy that goes into rural households and in and an informal industry in India is actually traditional biomass, which is not commercially sourced, and it's difficult to suggest whether that's actually sustainable or not because it's not cultivated specifically for the purpose of energy. So all of these transitions is what we're talking about there. So let's talk about the first transition. Electricity. The gentleman sitting in the back asked a question, are we reducing this entire debate to one of electricity? I think there's good reason why that happens. That's primarily because in the next 20, 30 years, if you're looking at the cleanest form of end-use delivered energy, electricity is it. There's nothing that gets closer to clean than electricity. Whether it's for cooking within your household, whether it's for heating, and of course for lighting and other applications. So in that sense, I think it's good to sort of reduce the discussion to electricity because that's the one that can actually be delivered at scale in a country like India. So we'll start with that look here. So as I said, 46 million households in India lack access to electricity connections even to this day. If for those of you who followed the sort of the system in India, looking at this new scheme called Saubhagya, which means sort of something that's been given to you, and in the Saubhagya scheme, every household in the country is expected to be connected to the grid in the next year and a half. In fact, even less than that. And 3/4 of those households are basically in these states. You're looking at 70 years after independence, 46 million households lacking connection to even basic electricity. And this, by the way, does not include one aspect that Dr. Kastru touched on, which is the service levels associated with electricity supply. So we basically did, as part of like a 9,000 household survey, which is the largest energy access focused survey in the country, survey across these 6 states of where exactly is the quality of electricity consumption. You'll see this here. You've got 96% of the villages are technically electrified, but only 69% of the villages actually have electricity of the households. And what we call above tier 0, which is basically less than 4 hours of electricity consumption, 4 hours of electricity supply a day, very poor reliability, fluctuations, all of that. So only 37% of the households actually were above what's tier 0, which is the poorest tier. Like there are 4 tiers, and perhaps a resident of Singapore will probably, every resident of Singapore will probably be above tier 4, right? Similarly for LPG as well, right? Only 22% of the households actually have LPG connections. Only 14% of them actually use LPG as the primary source of fuel, right? And only 5% use only LPG. So you can see that even those people who have an LPG connection prefer to do what's called fuel stacking. Because primarily firewood as well as other biomass-based materials or animal dung which is dried comes for free, and that's a useful source of energy. The problem is that it comes with other challenges, which is basically indoor air pollution, all of that. So when you measure across all of these, like there's still a significant bit of the population that's not yet there in terms of good quality energy, right? This is rural. Exactly, this is rural, which is about, good point, thank you, good point. So because obviously, in urban areas, this is going to be significantly higher, right? So this is the transition that we have to think about, because supplying electricity and supplying this energy to households in rural India today, urban India is consuming fossil fuels, so there's no question of doing a leapfrog, right, where you basically miss out. So people are talking about there's this huge underutilized fleet of electricity generation assets in the country. Can we effectively then move people from conventional, traditional fuels to electricity straight without going through the gas phase. There are already many households that are already doing that. Unfortunately, they're doing that in a illegal way where they are actually not paying for the electricity, but they're connecting, electricity-based cooking devices onto their plug points, and that's becoming a bit of a challenge in the rural grid itself. So this is a challenge that we'll have to meet. Right? Fossil fuel subsidy. A lot of people say that India is subsidizing fossil fuels, and there's a big call on the G20 to sort of remove this fossil fuel subsidy. But let's be very, very clear about one thing. India taxes fossil fuel more so than any other country in this world. Right? The 50% of the delivered price of LPG and petrol and diesel in the country is actually a tax. 50%, right? Which means that it makes it go beyond the affordability of the average citizen. So in effect, we're actually taxing it. But even if you look at the subsidy that's provided back, right? You're basically sort of taking from one hand, giving from the other. Most of it really goes to people who are in the higher income deciles, and this is the big challenge. And then we've tried to sort of do a behavior-based intervention in the country. For many of you are aware of it. It's called the Give It Up campaign, where households which feel that they are economically well off are sort of incentivized to give up their subsidy, and sort of there's a scroll of honor that's given, that has their name, and then there's now, after the initial round of Give It Up, you've basically demarcated and said, if you have an income more than 1 million rupees a year, you do not get the subsidy anymore. So this is another option that we are basically seeking to get people to sort of conserve fuel and sort of ensure the subsidy goes to the right kind of people. This is, as I said, I've got a bunch of slides that which talk about it, but since it's 20 minutes, we're going to run through some of them. So again, what are the reasons why many households do not choose to have electricity connection, right? Because, the duration of supply is very poor. The reliability in many cases is not very good. So these are the things that really need to be taken into account when the government's planning to actively go in there and ensure that, we connect every household to electricity grid itself. And what we did was basically, this particular scheme that's being rolled out, we collected data on every village that we surveyed. We basically took a stock take of what the existing assets are in terms of distribution transformers and what kind of effort is needed to actually electrify these households, right? So, do we need extensive grid extension? So, a village, the average person may just be like a point, but in reality, a village actually has a significant sprawl associated with it. So it's not enough if you have a transformer that just gets into the village. You then have the wiring that needs to go out for at least as much as 5 to 10 kilometers. Now, does that make sense to do at a very low voltage? Because then you're basically incurring a lot of losses, right? There's also theft that's possible. So you need to really think about in what way do you need to go about making this transition from kerosene, which is an unclean fuel, to electricity-based lighting systems, right? So you're looking at here basically almost 82% of the villages here are requiring some sort of modern infrastructure addition in order to be able to get electricity to the final households. And last mile delivery of cooking gas, right? If you're looking at it here, most of the gas distribution companies, India still relies on cylinders. Singapore, I think, has many pockets where the cylinders still are there. At least commercial entities, I've seen them use cylinders, but most houses perhaps have pipe gas. In India, given the population density in rural India, pipe gas doesn't make sense, right? So we have cylinder-based delivery for much of the country, except in dense pockets like in Delhi and Bombay, where there's a big pipe gas network. There's also other inefficiencies associated with that, right? LPG has good extractive chemical value to it. You don't want to burn it and create energy out of it. You can actually use it in a chemical manufacturing plant in a much better way than natural gas itself. So you would rather give natural gas to households rather than supply higher quality butane, which has some chemical value to it, instead of doing that. So there's a big possibility there in terms of shifting away from LPG to natural gas. But for that, where will the gas come from, right? Beyond household energy itself, as I said, there's you can look at productive use of energy, solar for irrigation. That's one, right? And you can also look at decent DC systems. So this is something that is gathering a lot of steam in terms of as a technology. Energy efficiency is something that every country must focus on before looking at renewable energy. Primarily because if you want to replace existing sources of electricity with renewable, it's better that you do it when you've maxed out on energy efficiency. Otherwise, you'll effectively require a higher scale RE system, right? So something that you could have done with 100 watt, you'd require 150 watt, right? So you're looking at powering households in rural India with as little as 125 watt of a solar panel, but primarily because you're looking at DC devices. So your regular fan, which is at about maybe 75-80 watt, can now actually supply the same at 25 watt. Right? A DC brushless fan can do it at 25 watt. Now, only thing is now it has to be manufactured at scale. Right? You can't manufacture 1,000 units, but if you manufacture 1,000,000 units, you get it to be the same cost as a regular fan. Right? An LED bulb, I'll come to that in the next few slides. Right? A cost of which is about 300 rupees about a year and a half, 2 years ago, is today at 75 rupees. How is that? Because there were millions of units that were procured. Right? And similarly with DC pumps as well, right? Irrigation pumps. So we need to ensure that renewable energy sort of gets a focus only after you max out on the energy efficiency part. This is really regarding how do we go about mapping areas where solar-based distribution, solar-based irrigation pumps make sense, right? Because solar pump-based irrigation makes sense when water tables are adequately high, when the flow rate required is not very high, right? For those kind of crops which are not extensively water intensive. And also more importantly, we need to look at what is the farmer's ability to take up a solution which is slightly expensive upfront, but then over the course of its life has better innovation. So going about planning for moving people away from diesel-based, electricity-based pumps to solar-based pumps, right? The next transition that we talked about is rural to urban, and the first one that really comes to mind is the LED campaign that India has been running, right? So this is a live monitor that's there. This is of course a screenshot, but anybody can go to this portal called Ujala dashboard, Google it, and kind of gives you like this a live count of how many LED bulbs have been sold or distributed across the country, right, in real time. Because this is the kind of monitoring that's happening with this particular program. That said, the country sells about 700 million incandescent bulbs even today, right? We might be selling millions and millions of LED bulbs, but the problem is we sell as many, if not more, incandescent bulbs because of the sheer difference in cost. An incandescent bulb costs anywhere between 10 and 15 rupees. An LED lamp, even at the scales or whatever today costs between in the market 75 and 115 rupees, depending on what wattage you're buying. So it's seemingly easier for a person who doesn't understand the economics of it to just buy 7 incandescent bulbs every time he sort of loses the filament in it, instead of sort of really using the LED one. But there is an active campaign here to move everybody. And I don't think there's this program of this scale running anywhere else in the world right now. Air conditioning. This is something that if anybody's read this new book, Drawdown, that talks about what are the 10 things that will change it for the world in terms of climate change. The second most important thing after sort of population control is reducing your air conditioning demand, right? So air conditioners are basically something that's going to drive a lot of the demand from India. How do we basically ensure that those, the HFCs that are used within that do not adversely affect, climate is something that India is really thinking about actively. Industrial energy use. Industry is something where we need to look at fuel switching in a much bigger way. This is a slide that really talks about understanding, right, where exactly are the potential for industry in terms of overall emissions and things like that. But electricity is replacing coal and natural gas in industry is something that India needs to look at actively. And this is where a big challenge is, because the quality and the supply of electricity has not been good enough for Indian industry today to actually incentivize industry to move to that. And this is an important slide here. I'd just like you to focus a little bit on this. So if you look at the green bars here, that basically the yellow and the blue bars, this talks about utilized capacity of generation at cost, let's say less than 2 rupees, utilized generation at cost between 2 and 3 rupees. So those are the ones. And the blue is really what this tells you, that you have these many units of electricity at less than 2 rupees, which is still lying there unutilized. So instead, you end up sort of sourcing, right, these many units from those generation plants that are 4 units and above. And this is basically because you've got a grid out there which is not completely interconnected, and so in order to satisfy local demand, you're willing to source these many units from industry, from power plants that are generating electricity at more than 4 rupees, when you've actually got capacity in those power plants which are actually generating at less than 2 rupees, or even capacity, spare capacity. And why is that happening? Primarily because the electricity grid is not able to sort of really cater to the geographical sort of diversity that exists across the country. And this speaks to the point that Dr. Kastro was talking about. We've got essentially, 5 different SAARC countries within India itself, right? In terms of the sheer diversity and the need to, bring together the generation potential that exists across these countries. So first, I think India needs to tap into that before we actually make any further transition. From autarky to global markets, really, I'm going to skip through this because I've shown the 5-minute marker, but broadly what we're saying is that given that we're going to be more integrated into the global value chain, it is important that India sort of starts really investing in looking at what exactly are its overall levels of, oil stock. We want to become a member of the IEA, we're an associate member right now. We do not nearly meet any of the criteria that the IEA sets. Looking at, for example, LNG vessels, right? We've got significant capacity of LNG terminals that's come up, but India does not own an LNG vessel. I mean, it does not contingent on, of course, owning it, but do we even have our overall supply line secure, right? Growth and sustainability. I mean, I'll talk about a few important things here. One of the more important aspects of electricity generation in India from conventional fuels is really the use of water. And this is a study that we did again jointly with C-STEP, TERI, and a bunch of other research organizations in India, which really talks about the potential for water saving if you move to better practices in the use of water in thermal power plants, right? So basically from open cycle to closed cycle systems, and as you can see, there's almost a 90% decrease in overall water withdrawals if you actually move to closed cycle systems. So this is something that is really, really important for India to consider, and this can have significant ramifications. The energy-water nexus, because more than 70% of our generation relies on water, is more than, it's an imperative that we really focus on the water side of the story to push the debate towards renewable energy. And India's RE, sort of revolution, right? If you look at it, one of the big bottlenecks in really renewable energy penetrating into the market is the cost. And what exactly about the cost is the challenge, is the financing. So we'll get to that in 2 slides. And if you look at policy certainty, I mean, I think there was a mention about policy certainty not being there in the South Asian context. And you can see this here, right? The wind energy capacity growth is a clear illustrator of that. The growth and the spikes that you see and the dips, primarily because there was a policy that existed in years 1 and 2, and then they withdrew that, and then the investors basically felt, this is not good enough for me. So there was an initial clear trend of rising trend, and then there was a withdrawal of the policy, then you saw the dip in the overall capacity addition in that particular year. Again, when the policy was reinstated, to put that up. So what does this do? This basically leads to suboptimal use of your manufacturing capacity for wind turbines. Right? India has a capacity of about 10,000 megawatt in terms of manufacturing, whereas our annual installations are only about 3,000. We're catering to a significant overseas market, but we could clearly do a lot more domestically if there was more policy certainty itself. And solar, the sad part of the story is that everybody thought that India has achieved it when it comes to wind. Unfortunately, we've nowhere close to achieving the wind potential. We currently have about 25 gigawatts of wind, whereas the overall capacity or the potential of the country is close to about 300 gigawatt. So, which means that we really need to focus on an industry that was thriving and that had its sort of base in India. But instead, everybody got pulled into the solar debate because of the really falling costs. That was driven by, initial installations in Western Europe that resulted in China having a lot of plants, and then, the scale resulting in the drop in cost. As you can see, in December 2010, the price of 1 unit of electricity from solar was about 10.95, dropped to about 2.44, phenomenal drop in about 7 years' time. I mean, and right now it looks like it might be plateauing, and I'm almost done. Thanks so much, Jordan, for that. So this is one of the big drivers for how India might actually achieve its big targets of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, of which 100 is from solar, 60 is from wind. And this has been a big driver, but how do we actually achieve it? As I said, it's a finance game right now. From our conversations with the grid operator, one thing that we found out is that it's not a technical challenge to actually get our grid to absorb renewable energy in a big way. Whether it's solar, whether it's wind, it's really about how do you ensure that there is the people who invest in renewable energy actually do not feel the risk associated with the sector. As you can see here, right, the overall cost of financing itself is about 60% of the overall LCOE associated with it, right? In countries like Dubai, which actually had similar if not lower bids, it was really the financing at such a low rate, right? India, you're looking at about 11% cost of financing, whereas in the West, you're looking at about 4% after certain sort of risks are actually taken in. But then just borrowing from overseas does not help, because then you've got to handle the currency fluctuation risk. So how do you have a mechanism built in that will allow you to borrow from overseas but then cover the hedge cost without actually significantly losing out on the overall cost of borrowing itself? So the lowest in the recent bids have indeed benefited from it because they've created a mechanism that allows for that hedge and also decreases the risk. Primarily because India's utilities are so cash strapped that nobody is willing to sell electricity to them. So if you're a renewable energy generator, right, and you're selling to a utility that's insolvent, the risk associated with actually sort of selling to them is so high that the cost of financing automatically goes up. So when you can actually have a clear PPA that ensures that the person off-taking the power is somebody who will guarantee that off-take happens, then you decrease the overall cost of financing. And that's really what is changing the game for renewable energy in India. And that will certainly drive it to some point in time. But then after that, the technical people who all said, yes, we can handle it, we'll need to step up to say that, you know what, we'll actually be able to take that up. So, final slide, as I said, India is, this is, as you can imagine, this is a group of whales that are, partying, after, oil was discovered in Pennsylvania. To all the people out here who are not aware, before oil was discovered, it was basically whale blubber that was, substituting all forms of burning across the world, right? So whale hunting was so massive that we drove many of these species to extinction. And when oil was discovered, everybody said, hey, you know what, I don't need whales anymore because, I've got all the oil that I want from Pennsylvania oils. And similarly, we're looking at, a different transition for India today, right? Where, we have a lot of oil that's available, but the renewable energy is sort of like the new source that everybody wants to go to. And I think India is well on its way to sort of doing more than it can. And really, the final point is the transition that's being asked of India today, or for that matter, any one of the South Asian countries, in terms of moving away from conventional to modern sources of energy, is a much bigger ask or a much tougher transition at the income levels that the country is currently experiencing. So I think it will be good if all of us can appreciate the kind of challenges that a country at income levels that India is undertaking in order to enable this transition to happen globally. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what struck me is the reminder that when we talk about energy transition, we're talking about a multi-layer issue. It's not just a single issue. There are so many different aspects, so many different sectors. This shows how complex the issue is. So the next speaker, I'd like to invite Ms. Lydia Powell to give a presentation, please.
I hope I can sit down. I don't think I'm young enough to hold the mic and change it. So my title is very close to what Karthik talked about. I call it India's belated transitions, prospects for leap from to low carbon energy. I'm glad that I focused more on conceptual issues. Karthik told you about the data and so on. The key message I want to convey is that India is undergoing 3 simultaneous transitions, unlike all other countries which went through the transition in that order. India is trying to do an energy access transition, like Karthik mentioned, which could be, you can call it market failure, you can call it state failure, but it's a failure to provide energy access. The second transition I have come up with is a market transition, that is, the Indian energy sector is dominated by the state, so it is trying to introduce the private sector and market as the mediator between supply and demand. There you can call it state failure. And the last one is a low carbon transition, which is again a market failure to provide quality energy. Which will prevail and to what extent is something I'm still not sure about. I'll leave that to you. My answer is all will progress, but none will be complete. But I have a hope that decentralized renewable energy forms may facilitate leapfrogging to a low carbon economy where everyone has access with minimum or no intervention from state or private bureaucracies. That is just a hope. I'll just go through each of the transitions. I have a slightly different take, so I'll go through that. Energy access transition, you can have 2 parts. One is rapid industrialization. India somehow missed that. According to our chief economist, it is premature under-industrialization. So energy access through industrialization is unlikely. The second option is state policy. What you can see is state policy is in the lead. We have many schemes with many names, but all are state-led schemes. Because they are state-led schemes, affordability is very critical, by which I mean subsidies is very important. And most of the schemes, whether it's electricity or cooking fuel, I'm primarily talking about household access. It's actually based on grid-based electrification, based on thermal and primarily coal-based electricity. And for cooking, it's primarily based on subsidized access to liquid petroleum gas, which is petroleum. What impact will this have on the overall transition to market as the mediator of supply and demand? I don't know, because state intervention is seen as the biggest barrier to having the market as the mediator. The answer you get from the government is that direct benefits transfer schemes will separate the state-led and the market-led schemes for energy access. So both this energy access transition is unfortunately based on, fortunately or unfortunately, based on fossil fuels and state intervention. The second transition is a market transition. It began about 2 decades ago. Dr. Narayan would know about it because he was in the government when it began. It was entry of private sector in energy supply, transport and distribution. Initially started with petroleum refining, oil and gas production and so on. It then progressed with petroleum retailing, power generation, distribution, coal mining, etc. Power over energy sector partially conceded to, you can call, independent regulators, so that is one shift to the market. There is some effort to deregulate the pricing of energy. Select fuels, especially fuels seen as used by the affluent, for example, petrol, have been decontrolled, at least to some extent. And there has been a creation of infrastructure, mostly grid-based, to facilitate trade, whether within the country or cross-border. State interventions, here the problem is state interventions for energy access, which is seen as the key barrier. If you talk to the private sector, they see state interventions as a key barrier. And the state holds control even on energy pricing, and when they offer a separation of subsidies, there is inadequate provision for budgetary support. So once again, this transition also favors fossil fuels and led by the market. The last transition is a low carbon transition. Karthik talked about the details. What is driving this transition is ambitious targets for non-fossil fuels. You all know the numbers. It's all state intervention for realization of the targets. Lot of schemes, subsidy, capital subsidy, transmission, lot of variety of subsidies are offered. And there is hope also. There is declining carbon intensity, active participation of the private sector, partly attracted by the subsidies. There is overwhelming public support for the narrative of sustainability, so that takes care of the positive side. Clean electricity at the point of consumption, at least at the point of consumption, is the vector for renewable energy. I think that is an important point. Renewable energy will depend critically on electricity. Again, this low carbon transition is going to be affected by the state intervention for energy access, because like I said in the first slide, energy access is primarily based on fossil fuels. If you have taken a look at the draft energy policy, which is available on the internet, it actually actively seeks a role for the markets, even for renewable energy. I've just given some sentences from the draft energy policy. Renewable energy must support transporting and balancing act on its own. All cost of balancing and burden of renewable purchase obligation on discoms. So it thinks that it's unfair that you load the discoms with all the costs of renewable energy and must run status eventually withdrawn and so on. There are a lot of other sentences. So this favors a non-fossil fuels, and again it is state-led. So there is a contradiction you can see in all three transitions. I just looked at some of the global transitions to see what worked. Past energy transitions were not driven by cost competitiveness. The first major global transition, which took a very long time, 1500 to 1900, it was both a qualitative and a quantitative transition. UK made the first transition from biomass to fossil fuels. Actually, what drove the shift was development of technologies at the supply and the demand end for textiles and so on. The second significant transition, 1900s, primarily oil and fossil fuel era. Again, it was both quantitative and qualitative. By qualitative, I mean it's a higher energy content and lower in carbon. Share of coal in global supply peaked in this period. A lot of technology, steam engines, internal combustion engines, electric motors, all these at the demand end, that drove relative shifts between fossil fuels. actually share of oil and gas increased at the expense of coal. So it was not the scarcity of coal that led to the introduction of expensive oil. It was actually technological shifts at the demand end, where consumers wanted convenient and clean fuels for cars, radios, other appliances and so on. And grid-based fuels also took on, natural gas and electricity. The cost to consumers was actually above alternatives. We can discuss this later. Some trends in India's carbon emissions from 1990 to 2016, actually the carbon intensity, carbon emissions per unit of energy is actually increasing because access to modern energy sources. Karthik mentioned about 25% of India's energy is biomass, raw biomass. So energy carbon intensity for per unit of energy use is actually increasing, but carbon emissions per unit of GDP is decreasing. So partly because it is predominantly service sector dominated and partly because efficiency improvements. Some concluding thoughts. See, if you look at the share of fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels between 2001 and 2016, you see that fossil fuels, which is yellow, dominates. I must tell you that this does not include biomass. When you include biomass, this will look slightly different. I feel that this argument that solar is cheaper than coal narrative is not relevant and not very accurate also. Low carbon transition is unlikely, like I said in the previous slide, no transition was based on cost competitiveness. Low carbon transition is unlikely to be driven by change at the level of primary energy supply. I feel it will be driven by demand, by availability of decentralized high quality energy in packets, whether it's battery or any other form, and by consumers who want higher quality energy. And the hope is each energy transition is quicker than the other, like I showed you. The first one took hundreds of years, second one about 100 years. This one may be less than 50 or so. And a lot can happen in 20 years. So I'll close there.
Thank you very much. Actually, I think the two presentations complement each other very well. The first speaker spoke very much about India's profile from a ground perspective, whereas the second speaker looked at it at the policy level. So now, I would like to invite Dr. Liu Yang to be the discussant for this panel and to give his thoughts on this topic as well as the presentation of the speakers. Please.
Christopher. So thank you for two presenters that give us a perfect picture on the key challenges facing India for low carbon transition. So I'd like to deliver three key messages in following two presentations. So the first one is really energy transition is a multi-dimensional challenge for major emerging countries, including India and other South Asian countries. So just one example, short example. In 1880, our humankind has invented the first electricity grid, but 140 years later today, and around 70% of African country population do not have access to electricity. But 24 years ago, we have the first mobile phone, and now 73% of African population have access to digital mobile network. So it just demonstrates clearly that electricity access or energy transition are highly complicated. So it's in utility sector, it's almost correlated with some monopoly and monopoly. So in emerging countries, in developing world, we need multiple transition process simultaneously, as stated by our previous presenters. So I think this is the key message. We need to manage multiple dimensions in this energy transition process. The second is message, like I draw from two presentation is we need to handle energy efficiency and renewable the same time. So, as the first speaker has mentioned, in India, we have very successful story about LED light bulbs implementation. So government has provided strong policy support to upscale energy efficient light bulbs at state level and country level. And this has driven down fast manufacturing costs. So this is a very successful story, but is it scalable? So this is the question that has been raised by our speakers as well. So in developing world, we need to consider energy efficiency as the first view, especially in these countries, energy demand growth will be huge. If we do not handle energy efficiency, and we'll waste money in building up huge electricity grid, electricity infrastructure that would not be optimized for long-term scenario. So that's why we need to manage at first energy efficiency before thinking about renewables integration. So this is the second message I got from our speakers. And the last one is we need to create some innovative business models to to make cost of finance, to manage cost of finance. So in India context, we have already seen the cost of finance or proportion of debt servicing is quite high compared to the rest of the world. I think it's a common problem for many developing countries. Okay, so that's why we need some big programs that can help reduce cost of finance. And it is also a big challenge that South Asia is facing now, because without increased electricity excise or integrated power market, we cannot really easily create a scale for making cost of finance economically viable. And also we need involvement of private sector to meet huge financing demand. So this is a huge challenge that these South Asian countries will need to solve in to ensure the success of this energy transition process. Okay, so I just stop here. So this is the these are three key messages that I have learned from our two speakers. So now I give the floor to Christopher. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I open the floor for questions and comments. I welcome everybody to join in to share their thoughts about what has been said this morning. Questions, comments, everything is welcome. Yes, we have someone there.
Hello, Andreas Essel from Technical University Vienna. Very good presentation, thank you very much. I have one question for Mr. Ganesan. European grid is very interconnected with a lot of trading, and it's also very good for security of supply. So, looking at South Asia and India, what do you think are the most critical issues or the most challenges to deal with within the country, connectivity and cross-country?
I'll take one more question. Yes, Dr. Narayan.
Small clarification from Ganesan. If I understand, the presentation on the rural economy was concentrated on 3 or 4 states, because if you take other states like Kerala or Madhya Pradesh, etc., the picture is totally different. So I think, if I'm not right, just for you to confirm, that you are talking about a small portion of the country and not the whole country, number one. And the second one on the pricing, when you talked about the under 2 rupee generation capacity unutilized, I do think that the total amount available is substantially small. It's very small. I don't think. I think the substantial capacity is available between the 2 to 4 megawatts. Am I right? What is the proportion of out of this 300 gigawatts of capacity that is represented by the under 2 rupees that you're talking?
Thank you. So, before I respond to either of the questions, I think I'd like to just stress on the point that Lydia made at the end of the presentation, which I thought was a very good way to sort of end hers, which is that I think the transition will not happen based on prices, because today in rural India, many households are happy to pay up to rupees 20 for every unit of electricity. The average tariff that I would be paying in my house in a city like Delhi is about 6 or 7 rupees. So you've clearly seen that there is value in actually paying as much as 20 rupees for every unit of electricity, and that it's not the fact that it was cheap that resulted in people moving to off-grid based solution, whether it's solar or biomass based or anything else, right? And I think ultimately people realizing the value in the service and what it means to them is what will actually drive it, and to that extent economics may not drive it. Thank you, Lydia, for making that point. On the question that the gentleman raised on the interconnectivity within and outside, India, unfortunately, so the way it was designed was that generation was sort of given away to the different states, and you also had state transmission utilities established somewhere in the 70s. It was originally sort of everything was one single company called NTPC, which handled both transmission and generation, and then it, in order to sort of give more autonomy to the states, they established state transmission utilities and they established state generation companies. And what then happens is that you're basically coordinating already within the country about 30 different subsets, right? And effectively you also have to ensure that you're able to sort of move as much power between these different entities. But the way it was structured until the 1990s was that everybody was just trying to meet the demand that existed within their boundary and not really looking to satisfy what was outside. And as a result, you never really built up the capacity to move power across. And we don't have the geographic benefits that Northern Europe, for example, provides the rest of Europe, right? For example, massive pumped hydro storage facilities in Norway and in Sweden, where you can effectively pump as much electricity from Denmark when it's cheap, and then take that back in when it's when you require it in these countries itself. And as a result, what's really happened is that there are limits on how much power can actually move across state boundaries, because states don't tend to play by the rules, right? So there are some poorer states that tend to overdraw, and as a result, the system collapsed. For example, in July 2012, the largest blackout of its kind, nearly 600 million people, in the northern belt thrown out of electricity supply, primarily because there was this disruption in the way one particular state decided to act with regard to using electricity. So I think establishing the rules of the game and ensuring that everybody has a financial incentive to play in that is really what is important. So we do not have an ancillary services market that's functioning today to basically say, when the frequency goes down, I will start up a generator and I will then provide the power there. Right? Once that comes in and there's money and that money is actually seen, I think we'll have a much better system in place. And to Dr. Narayan's question, well, it's 6 states. The 6 states represent about 45% of the population of India. So UP alone. Well, GDP-wise not. I mean, again, I think the same game that India plays with the rest of the world, India needs to play within its states as well, right? The hiding behind the poor debate, I think, is something that many external organizations have highlighted about India. That you have one rule for India as a country, and you have one rule for the rich as a country. Just to put it in perspective, the average resident in Delhi consumes as much electricity on a per capita basis as somebody in Germany does. Okay, which means that there is potential within the country to actually pay and consume that kind of electricity, but it's just that you haven't really replicated that across. I mean, that's being really the frankness that Dr. Castro asked for in this conversation is really that inequity is something that's prevalent within the economy, right? And we need to address that on its head if we really want to move it. And the second question, you're right. There is there is not nearly as much capacity in the under 2 rupee generation. It was just a sort of, it was not a hyperbole either. What we're basically saying is that if you did indeed optimize the overall mix, I'm looking to save about $3 billion a year, right? I'm looking to save about $3 billion a year if I were to be sourcing electricity from on a true merit order basis, right? Not, for example, with narrow constraints saying that, oh, I own this generation asset, I've already paid for its fixed cost, right? Let me now try and sort of, generate as much as I can out of it. And that's essentially what ends up happening if you have 25 different entities, which are basically, all managing a system that they feel they want to, squeeze the maximum out of it. The system as a whole loses, as I said, up to $3 billion. But true point that, in reality, there may not be as much to squeeze out of it. In theory, there's at least as much to squeeze out of it. Yeah.
Okay, next round of questions. No? So far, no. Then let me ask one question first. I'd like to ask Lydia a question. You mentioned that, in India there's the support for narrative for sustainability. But my question is, how much does that actually translate into the willingness to pay by the consumer? And then the second and third question for both speakers is the question of price sensitivity. I mean, in the Indian context, how price sensitive are the consumers? If you move to a more advanced system, and let's say if it costs more, are the consumers actually willing to absorb that cost? And the third one, again on the consumer, is a very practical issue about the collection of bills. I mean, like pay your bills. I hear a lot from the earlier presentation about cash-strapped utilities. Is one of the, I'm speaking not knowing much about the sector. So my question is there an issue with collection of fees from the user? Nobody pays, that's why the utility doesn't get enough funds, or what's the issue with cash-strapped utility? Thank you.
First one on willingness to pay, if I take Delhi as an example, I think that's why I use the word narrative. Though there is support for the narrative, willingness to pay doesn't match the enthusiasm for the word sustainability. For example, there is a lot of complaints about Delhi being very polluted, and responding to that, they tried to close down all the coal-based power plants and put up gas-based power plants. None of the gas-based power plants are actually working to full capacity. Some of them as low as 20%. And the reason is the distribution companies cannot purchase the gas-based power, because most of the gas has to be imported. And the discoms say that consumers are not willing to pay. I think there is a disconnect. The people think that free energy is, like renewable energy should be free, more or less. So I don't think there is a connection between the additional cost for clean, high-quality energy translating into higher bills. That connection hasn't been made, and Delhi is one of the states with the highest per capita incomes, and most of the 80% of the consumers of electricity are households in Delhi. There are no agricultural consumers, there are no industry, very few, business and households. So even there the willingness to pay is very low. So the two discoms operating in Delhi purchase coal-based power from faraway states. That is the most competitive, and that's what they can sell. The second one, willing to absorb the cost, I think that was the question.
And collection of bills.
Yeah, I think that willingness, the message of sustainable energy costing more hasn't been conveyed accurately. That's why I use the word solar cheaper than coal. People think that it should be very cheap, clean, high quality energy. I think the message, the nuanced message about high quality energy hasn't got through. Yes, there is an issue with collection. The states which Karthik displayed on the chart, most of the states, they also provide statistics on how many units are actually paid for. But it's not a simple story of people just not paying for electricity. There are a lot of complications. I won't go through that. Much of the electricity is actually taken by unorganized sector industries. I think I can quote Dr. Narayan there in the conversation. He said much of the electricity that is consumed is actually and not paid for is not households. It's actually industries organized, operating in the unorganized sector. And very often the blame is assigned to farmers taking electricity and not paying for it. That is also not a very accurate picture because they don't get electricity most of the time. Electricity that is unaccounted for is usually labeled as stolen by the agricultural consumer. So the picture is very complicated, so I would caution against drawing simple conclusions on Indians not paying for electricity.
I think Lydia has said most of what is there to be said. You did raise one question about the sustainability result in people being willing to pay more. Unfortunately, in the case of electricity, we really can't say because the counterfactual, which is basically having a separation of wires in retail, does not exist in India. For example, if you were in the state of Texas in the US, where there was a wire and service provision separation, somebody could say, what, I want to procure wind-based power from wherever the utility is sourcing from, and I'm willing to pay the premium. Unfortunately, in India, it's one utility that basically sells a product which is a composite of whatever it ends up sourcing it from, and that is typically the cheapest, and everybody basically pays for that. Now that said, you could ask, would a household be willing to pay to offset, for example, what a poorer consumer is not able to pay, and implicitly that's already happening in the country. So as Lydia mentioned, what's happened today in the electricity sector is that richer households are already, because they consume more electricity at the higher tariff slabs, cross-subsidizing poorer households which are consuming at the lower tariff slabs, which are subsidized. And in some sense, there is an internal cross-subsidy in the household sector. What is the big problem in the economy is really that the commercial and the industrial units are basically cross-subsidizing agriculture as a large consuming group. So, as much as Lydia, what the point she said was that agriculture can't be blamed so much for this lack of payment, it's really the politicians who've really sort of, given them the carte blanche feeling that, go ahead and do what you have to. I'll turn a blind eye to you. That's unfortunately the message that's been communicated to people who have indulged in, whether it's theft, whether it's non-payment of bills, whether it's, any kind of behavior that's not seen as, commercially justified, right? And because of that political backing they have, these groups have thrived. And as a result, today, if you had to go back and withdraw the freedom that's been given to these groups, right, or the political patronage that's been given to these groups over, 3 or 4 decades, it's very difficult because they already have experienced what it means to sort of have that, political sort of, blessing on you. And that is something that's going to be a challenge. And I think in terms of overall payment of bills, it's also in the interest of the DISCOM to keep this completely grey. People could say, the moment you install a meter somewhere and you start recording how much is it that this person is consuming, you should be able to go and sort of look at him and say, what you're doing. The problem is that at different levels of the DISCOM, there are different incentives for keeping people, people's consumption not clear, because ultimately that results in some sort of like rent-seeking behavior. The lowest level linesman is able to sort of impose on the other consumers, and that payment sort of goes up. So it's basically, prevalent corruption, whatever it is you want to call it, that's really resulting in the system that we have today. So,
thank you. Just to widen this conversation beyond India, I was wondering if my friends from Bangladesh and Sri Lanka can speak very quickly whether they also encounter similar issues with regards to willingness to pay.
From Sri Lanka, basically we have a similar situation but in a different context. Sri Lanka we have 100% access to electricity, and electricity but the local access maybe 95% using electricity now. So the challenges are a bit different in that context, and one of the key aspects basically in the political level what's happening is we have more education to politics. I think that's something highlighted earlier, and some authorities were able to send the message to politics in a different context. Because we are not talking about energy separately. We talk about energy as a part of the economy. One example is basically we have this electrification of railway, and the electric vehicles, for example, and we have this national program of solar. We couple it together. We buy an electric vehicle and we put a solar panel there. So then we manage it, something like that. And also another example is basically we have the waste management program. We have given higher tariff for waste, like almost double tariff now, to absorb the issue of waste into the the guaranteed income for waste project. Where the banks are very happy because we have 20 of guaranteed tariff. Where the banks are ready to fund for that. So we always talk about how to integrate the energy into the economic sector and then send that message to us. So therefore always we use this national or global level indicators to include the economy to energy, and then talk to politicians and they take the decisions in that context. So it has been a very success story, and of course we had other challenges like promotion of coal because of the cost issue. Personally, we had this tariff that the slabs are there, like how subsidies happening, and that has become a kind of a promotional thing for the high tariff sector to go solar. Then the government has used we had this net metering scheme. Now those days what we had is a program where if you have excess electricity you can't sell, but you can bank it for the next 10 years, so we can accumulate, but you can't sell the electricity to the grid. Recently, a year back, we changed that culture. Now we can sell the electricity to the grid. Either as a separate thing, you can get the electricity from the grid and then sell it back there, or with the excess, we can sell, or otherwise we can go to the normal net metering thing. So thereby looking at the local context, we were able to shift from one policy regime to another. Every year is happening, so we have dynamic changes in the situation to promote solar, and thereby we were able to indicate more solar, but still solar and other renewable resources. So I think it's basically what I'm talking about. We have to go for a locally adaptable, locally fit-in system, because there are many variations within the South Asia region, so you can't just copy. But we are following India's visions and learning in a hard way sometimes. We are moving forward, but not the way we have expected basically. So still we are trying to go for more interventions.
Thank you. Bangladesh, your side. Thank you, Dr. Len. Similar to Sri Lanka, we do have more than 70% of electricity access in our urban and rural areas. However, in Bangladesh, we are trying to replicate the solar system, which is built in our country. So it's basically for the poor people and in the rural areas. So in that area, we are replicating for the solar system, pump and solar irrigation and those systems. So in that case, we are more replicating towards those sectors rather than just going for with the heavier electricity and coal method for best energy access to the urban areas. So yeah, that's it from my side. Bob, you have a question?
Just I'm not sure whether it is simple questions. You are the experts. I have not done enough homework. When do you think India's CO2 emissions, energy related, will peak? Sort of come to a peak. Would it be before 2050? Because I see that there is a big momentum, because this non-commercial energy fuels still used quite extensively, and then fuels emissions zero. So there is a strong sort of momentum to switch to modern energy. So that's will probably cause more sort of emissions if they switch to energy, to renewable energy. Simple question is, will India be able to take its energy-related CO2 emissions before 2050?
This is a personal answer. I think the government
Yes,
is
there are a lot of
trying
reports.
to avoid giving a definite answer on this.
Everybody here is speaking their personal
Yeah, I think before 2050, yes. Usually, it is usually China plus another 15 to 20 years. That is the rule you can use. So, I think around 2040.
Actually, the present government has been fairly aggressive in committing itself to climate change goals, particularly Mr. Modi's government in the last 2-3 years, has been very, very aggressive about committing itself, and there is a much more investment going in for renewables now than for coal. In fact, coal use now is about 70% of total generation capacity. Will come down to another 15-20 years. Will come down to 50%. That is already happening, and it's happening because, I mean, I just mentioned it. It's happening because of those 3 different factors. So yeah, very complicated. I have no, I would say I have no hesitation today. I do not see anything.
Very glad to hear that.
The idea of peaking early, I think, is can lead to a race to the bottom. Is one theory that we have, is that in a bid to sort of try and peak soon, what will happen is that you'll end up augmenting systems that will result in higher emissions, and you might actually peak at a higher level than if you peak later. So if I peak later, I might have a better chance of peaking at a lower level, and as a result, my overall cumulative flow of emissions that's coming out of the economy will be low. Whereas, if you say, you know what, you put a lot of pressure from outside to sort of really peak sooner, what will end up happening is that what's today cost competitive, right, is basically still fossil fuel based energy. What will end up happening is you start investing in those systems and you get blocked in. So you basically say, you know what, I want to try and peak by 2035 or pre-2030, for example. You'll end up investing in coal-fired power plants saying, you know what, as long as I'm showing that I'm peaking, the rest of the world will happen. Whereas you're not really looking at the long-term consequences of decreasing from that. And I think that peaking at a slightly lower, at a later point, but at a lower point, is perhaps more useful than peaking earlier. So this is something that, comes out as a
very important point, because currently, look, Bangladesh and Pakistan are going in a different direction. Because the Chinese resistance that is coming in. They are going into substantially greater coal production, coal powered power stations in the next 5 to 10 years. So you see energy, CO2 levels increasing substantially.
Can I just add to the debate? In India, we have power surplus in India. This is not because the government of India designed it to be that way. It happened because the industrial development, the way government expected, did not happen over the last 10 years. Now, if we have similar kind of industrial growth in the next 10 years, 20 years, you would not have peaking very soon. Right? But if industrial growth happens too soon, you will have peaking now. Lot of our coal-based power plants are planned, but it's not happening because there is no demand. So, when it will peak will depend on how the economy grows, in terms of its industrial development. So it's a difficult question to answer, because we don't know industrial growth will pick up soon or it will take time. Nobody can say.
Very good discussion, and I just wanted to add that the issue of when you peak and so on is issue of how much the grid can absorb renewables. This grid integration is also a very important part of it. Because on one hand we all love renewables and so on, that has to go on, but at the same time this base load aspect is very, very important. That's why how do you handle those intermittency of renewables will be an issue. So for a very big country like India, and managing such a large grid, and only renewables, and if there is no storage facilities and the development of storage, how fast it will come into the picture will also determine by when the peaking will happen and so on. The good thing is that there is a lot of focus going on the energy storage side of it, whether from Tesla and others also. There a lot of efforts, a lot of R&D is going on. But whoever will make a breakthrough in the energy storage systems, that will also change the whole dynamics of these energy systems as well. So let's hope that that breakthrough will come very fast, and then we'll have a complete different set of questions, complete different set of directions that will come. Yeah, so I thought I'll just share that perspective as well.
Yeah, I like how you link the energy transition process for a country to external factors, namely technology, and this is exactly I will make a presentation on in the next session. So, any more questions or comments on this point? No? If not, we can wrap up this session and then move on to the next one. Please join me in thanking the speakers and the discussants.